Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint these buildings in the snow. I've painted something like this last winter, if I'm not wrong, and it was really fun, so I decided to paint another version of it. I'm going to start by sketching the outline and I'm just going to make up the building shapes as I go. Since I want the setting to be snowy, I'm going to paint the road covered in snow. This is why they look a bit bumpy. I'm also going to add some pine trees for the winter feel, and as for the building, I'm just going to space it out. I want one on the left side and I want a few on the right hand side to make the composition look uneven. When I made the thumbnail design of this, I kind of liked it more if the building were placed lower. Unfortunately, I didn't realize this until I was painting the sky portion. I feel like with more of the sky, we would be able to include more color instead of the composition being heavy with the white of the snow. So please be mindful of this if you're going to draw or paint along. I would recommend for you to take down the composition a little bit lower so the sky is a bit heavier than the foreground of the snow. For the houses or the buildings, I first divide up the spacing, I make sure the heights are slightly different, and I also try to create different designs for the roof. Once I'm happy with the height and happy with the variation of the roof shapes, I'm going to add the windows. Just like the roof, I try to vary the size and shape according to how much space I have of the exterior of the buildings. Some are arched and some are rectangular, but I like to also play with how many panels they're divided into. You can also add things like blinds on the outside. This is just a fun addition, but I'm going to add a hanging decoration attached to the two roofs to fill the space. I'm going to add triangular flags, but you can also add things like Christmas lights. If you want to add blinds to your windows, make sure that they're a little bit thin so you have a bit more space to add on the blinds like what I'm doing here. I don't want this to be a serious painting, I just want to build a fun atmosphere, so I don't mind if the shapes of the windows and things are not overly accurate. I feel like the imperfection actually adds a little bit more whimsy to the painting. For a little bit more decoration, you can also add some plants in front of some of the windows. There's a lot of space still on the bottom half, so I'm going to add things like street lamps, trees, and bushes, and these are elements I tried to add in order to cover that huge space at the bottom. You can add things like a snowman or kids throwing snowballs at each other, but since I'm not good at drawing figures, I feel like it's going to mess up the painting, but if you're good at it, I feel like adding little people will add so much more life to the composition. I feel like the pine trees are a little bit too big, so I simplified it into just little triangles, and this should also complement the triangles for the decoration on the roof. Next, here are the colors I'll be using. This is Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke, Grey of Grey by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, and I'm also going to use Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. There are going to be small details, and for those I'm just going to use my Snowman Drawing Pen. I'm going to use two, one in 0.3 size and the other one in 0.1. I would suggest for you to use 0.1 though, because the 0.3 is a little bit too strong compared to the soft colors. For some softer definition around certain edges, I'm also going to use my watercolor colored pencil. This is by Faber Castell, and I'm going to use this dark brown. I'm going to mask little details, and for the masking fluid, I'm using this one by Maurice. Before I start to paint, I'm going to mask off certain areas. I'm going to add some small Christmas decorations here, which are just tiny dots that I place diagonally on the trees, and since the dots are very tiny, I also use the silicone brush. I'm also going to mask off the triangle decorations on top, so it's much easier for me to paint the sky later on. Now let's get to painting. While I wait for the masking fluid to dry, I'm going to start by painting the bushes in front. Since I want the bushes to look dry, I'm going to use this brown color. The brown is a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium, Payne's Grey Bluish, Vermilion, and Crimson Lake, and I just played around with the ratio until I get this color. You can also play with the ratio to get different tones, or even use Payne's Grey Bluish or certain blues to create a wintry icy feel, but since I want to use Payne's Grey Bluish by itself for the sky, I made the bushes brown. The masking fluid should be completely dry by now, so I'm going to use just the Payne's Grey Bluish to paint the sky at the back. I'm going to use a fairly light consistency for this part and use a thicker consistency for the top, so there's a slight gradient. I also left out a little bit of space, as you can see, since I'm going to paint a tree using a really thin consistency of the brown mixture. I just place a medium consistency in a small part, then I use a clean damp brush to help spread the paint. This will make the tree really light in color, and it will also blend with the background. Now to paint the rest of the sky, I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to paint in sections, just like what I did before. And this time I also want to leave a bit of space for the area for the smoke on the chimney. I started by covering the whole area with a thin consistency of Payne's Grey Bluish, and I'm going to go back in and dot in a thick consistency of Payne's Grey Bluish and help it move with my brush to spread naturally. For the edges, I decided to leave a bit of a white frame, and I think that this unevenness makes it look a little bit cuter. Now for the detail of the smoke of the chimney, I decided to use a thin consistency of Payne's Grey Bluish, and I just paint some squiggly lines on top so it looks slightly textured. Moving on to the pine trees or the Christmas trees, I'm going to use a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish and Hansa Yellow Medium, and I also added a touch of Vermilion to make the color slightly muted. And even though I drew these trees as just normal triangles, when I paint I want to add a bit of texture on the sides and the bottom so it looks a little bit more like a tree. I'm going to finish them off with the stem using a thick consistency of the brown, and then I'm going to use a clean damp brush to smudge some of the brown to add texture to the snow. Again, this is from a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish, Crimson Lake, and Vermilion with a bit of Hansa Yellow Medium, and to darken it and make the color muted, I added Payne's Grey Bluish. To create a lighter color, you can also add some Ray of Grey, so it's a bit easier to paint with a slightly thicker consistency. Next, let's paint the lamppost. I'm starting with Hansa Yellow Medium here, and on the side I added a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium and a bit of Vermilion, so it's a bit more orangey. Then I'm going to use a clean damp brush to spread a little bit of the paint and create a glowing effect. Now that the bushes are completely dry, I'm going back in with a thick consistency of the brown, and I also switched to my small brush using a very dry brush load to create really thin lines for the texture of the branches. I'm going to paint the tree next at the back before I forget about it using the same dark brown. You can see that I try to avoid the area of the glow of the lamp. This is because I'm going to use a thinner consistency of the brown later on, so the glow looks like it's still in front of the tree. Once I'm done adding the branches, you can see that I'm going to pick up a thinner consistency of the brown, and I'm going to try to connect the tree together so it looks a bit hazy. I also added some dots for some orange decoration using a mix of vermilion and Hansa yellow medium. Next, let's paint the roofs of the houses. I'm using a mix of Crimson Lake and Hansa Yellow Medium, and I added a bit of the dark brown into it so the color is a little bit more rich and slightly darker. And as I'm painting the roof, I like to leave out some white spots to indicate a little bit of snow. After I'm done placing the main color, I'm going to use a darker value of the same mix, so I just added more of the dark brown, and I also used a thicker consistency to paint some areas. I'm going to leave the chimneys for now, and I'm also going to use the same color to paint the roof on the side of the house. For this next one, I used a really thin consistency of a mixture between the dark brown and some gray of gray. Just like the previous roof, I've left out a bit of white space for the snowfall, and I'm also going to do the same thing for this next one. But for the color, I used the first color of the roof, and I added more Hansa Yellow Medium, so it's a little bit more orangey. As for the last one, I added more Payne's Grey Bluish, so the color is more of a muted brown. Now let's paint the exterior of the house. For this, I used a mix of buff titanium and vermilion, and I'm using a medium consistency to just cover the walls. I want to add a bit of shadow underneath the windows as well as under the roof, and for this I just added the dark brown mixture to the base color. If I add too much brown, it's going to mute the color too much, so I decided to add some Crimson Lake as well to deepen the red. I want the houses to be colorful, so for the next one I'm going to use green, and this is a mixture of Payne's Grey Bluish, Hansa Yellow Medium, and Grey of Grey. I forgot to paint the little canopy, so I used the same color as the roof for this building, and I'm going to then use a medium consistency to paint the exterior. Here I've forgotten to paint the attic, but please don't forget to do that. I'm going to go back to it later when I realize. Now for the shadow color underneath the roof and the canopy, I'm just going to add the dark green mixture that I used for the trees. So this is from a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium and Payne's Grey Bluish, which I've mixed into the base color, and just like before, I added under the roof and under the windows, and this time under the canopy as well. For the next house, I'm reusing the orange mixture, and I added some buff titanium, which comes to this pastel yellow ochre, I would say. You don't have to create the exact same colors, but I'm just showing you how I mix mine so you can reuse the colors that you've already pre-mixed. For the darker value of this house, I just pick more of the colors to the left, which has more of the dark brown. Again, for the last one, I'm just going to reuse the colors that I already have. I mixed in the green into the brown, and I also added more vermilion and buff titanium into the mix. At this point, I think I've mixed all the colors that I have on my palette, but I just want to show you that by playing around with the ratio, you can really create different colors or hues as well as different variations of those hues. For the darker version of this color, I tried adding the dark brown, but the color was too muted, so I decided to pick up some of the vermilion that I've already pre-mixed at the bottom, so the dark brown adds value, whereas the vermilion adds to the saturation. Now I'm just going to add some line details to the houses under the roof as well as the lines to divide up the stories. Next, I'm going to add the plants as the window decoration. I'm using the green mixture. This is from Payne's Grey Bluish, Hansa Yellow Medium, and a bit of vermilion. And I'm going to add this to some of the larger windows, even if I didn't sketch it out beforehand. I really like this tone of green, so I'm going to use it to paint the blinds as well. This is a thick consistency of the same color, and I feel like this dark green also matches the light green of the exterior. Next, I'm going to add some textures to the roof. For the color here, I'm just using a darker version of the same color or something that is similar to the base. And I tried to sort of create doodle textures by creating dashed lines or vertical lines following the shape of the roofs. While I'm at it, I'm also going to color the chimneys. For most of the houses, I'm just going to use the same base color as the exterior. Now let's move on to the windows. For some of the windows, I'm going to use a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium and a little bit of Vermilion to make the yellow a bit warmer. And for some of the windows with the lights turned off, I'm just going to use Payne's Gray Bluish. For the yellow or orangey window, I like to extend the color so it looks a little bit like it's glowing. Whereas for the dark windows, I'm just going to paint within the lines. I'm going to take the simple route here by just painting the window as a whole without adding on the details, since I'm going to paint on the details later using bleed-proof white. If you want your window frames to be black, you can also use your pen. Since there's already a lot of colors, I'm just going to use brown to paint all of the doors, but you can also play with the ratio to create different tones if you would like. I'm also going to use a dark brown to paint the fence between the buildings. Since the fence is behind the light, I'm going to treat it the same way as the tree. I'm going to be careful and not paint over the glow, since I'm going to use a thinner consistency of the same color over the glow to create a hazy look. Now let's move back to the foreground. I'm going to add more snow textures using gray, and I'm creating ovals in different sizes to indicate the uneven surface. For the paved area, I'm going to use the gray with added brown, so it'll turn into a slightly warmer gray, which will separate the paved area and the snow. And now that the doors are completely dry, I'm going to paint the windows of the door using the same warm yellow color. I'm also going to layer on more of the warm yellow for some of the windows if I feel like the color has faded too much as it dries. And next I switch to my 0.3 size pen to add on the details of the lamppost. You can also use a brush for this, of course, but by using a pen it's just so much easier to control. And if you only have access to the 0.1 size pen, you can also double up the lines to make it a bit thicker. I've forgotten about the texture of the roof here, so I'm just going to add it on. And while I have that dark brown, I'm also going to add details to some of the chimneys or any parts of the roof which needs a bit more definition. Since there's already a lot of things going on, I'm going to take off the masking fluid next, and I'm also going to fix areas which I've accidentally poured the masking fluid over, which ended up covering parts of the sky. For the tree decorations, I just kept it simple. One tree will just have yellow decorations and the other one red from Vermilion. And for the star on top, I used a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium and a bit of Vermilion. I'm going to use two colors for the flags on top, which is pink and a warm yellow. So the pink is from Vermilion and Buff Titanium, whereas the yellow is from a mix of Hansa Yellow with a bit of Vermilion. I'm also going to start adding the frames of the window, and I'm using a thick consistency of bleed-proof white. I've also switched to my small brush to make it much easier to control. After adding on the frames for the windows, I felt like the white was kind of thick and I don't want to add more white to the buildings, so I chose to use my black pen to outline the doors instead. This being said though, I felt like the lines were a little bit too thick and heavy, so I would prefer to either use my 0.1 size or to use colored pencil instead. And this is what I decided to do for the other details. I switched to my colored pencil. I felt like since the illustration is very small though, I really need to keep my pencil sharpened so the lines won't be too thick. Next, let's add more fine details. I'm going to use bleed-proof white in a thick consistency to add the snow texture on top of the roofs. And I'm also going to add snowfall by adding circles with the bleed-proof white in different sizes on the sky. I'm also going to add a bit of snow on the pine trees as well. Since the blinds are very tiny, I'm just going to add the details using my 0.1 pen. I'm adding lines following the diagonal tilt of the frames, and I'm also going to add some outlines. After this, I want to add small brick textures on the buildings, but I feel like the last building here looks too light, so I'm just going over it again with the same mixture, but in a slightly thicker consistency to glaze over the base. To paint the brick texture, I'm going to use the side of my bristles and paint tiny horizontal lines using a darker version of the base color in a very thick consistency, so the texture is almost opaque as it dries. After adding on the brick textures, initially I deemed this painting as finished, but after looking at it again the next day, I felt like the bottom left looks so empty. This is mainly because of the compositional mistake that I made at the beginning, so I decided to add another bush using a light consistency of the dark brown mix. Then I wait for it to dry before adding the branch textures on top. And after this last addition, that's it for this painting. I had so much fun with this one. I love painting scenes which are more fun and whimsical, a bit more illustrative, and I hope you enjoy it as well. If you did and would like to see more, feel free to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you can be notified whenever I publish a new tutorial. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!